But for more lasting change, more durable change, the industry has to come together and demand more accountability for media quality. This is the prisoner's dilemma type thing all over again. Brands, agencies, tech intermediaries, in my opinion, the major industry groups all have a role to play in here, but building shared responsibility via enforceable mechanisms is the only way to put the entire industry on a better path for fraud reduction.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Identity Architects, the InfoSum podcast that spotlights the leaders in the media industry shaping the future of data-driven advertising. I'm your host, Ben Cicchetti, and this week I had the opportunity to sit down with Zach Lain, Director of Global Data Partnerships at PepsiCo, to discuss the state of the data landscape, PepsiCo's approach to data collection and utilization, data privacy, the value exchange, and much, much more. Before we jump into that conversation, this is a reminder to hit that subscribe button to be alerted when new episodes of Identity Architects are available. But without any further delay, here's my chat with Zach. If you've attended an event in the last few years, chances are you've probably seen our next guest speak, as he seems to be one of the most in-demand speakers in our industry right now. Zach Lain, welcome to Identity Architects.
Hi, Ben. Thanks. Great to be here.
Now, I'm super excited to learn more about PepsiCo, learn more about you. For anyone who doesn't know you, can you just give us a quick introduction to yourself? And if somehow someone doesn't know who PepsiCo is, a quick introduction to PepsiCo.
Sure. I run a global data partnerships team at PepsiCo, where I oversee the piloting, embedding, and scaling of new data assets across the organization, cross-brand, cross-market. A majority of my time is spent on media unlocks, media-related use cases, but I also advise on routing data for the fleet, satellite data for the trucks, flavor data, packaging data for the R&D teams, among many others, really across the breadth and depth of CPG. It's kind of crazy. I've been at PepsiCo for a little bit more than 4 years, coming from a European CDP where I ran data supply. And before that, I spent several years in many different roles at Dow Jones, the parent company of the Wall Street Journal, including time working directly for the publisher and CEO. And for those that don't know PepsiCo, PepsiCo is one of the largest food and beverage companies in the world, home to brands like Lay's, Cheetos, Pepsi, of course, Gatorade, Quaker, and many, many more. We operate in over 200 markets and enjoy it over 1 billion times every day, which, as I say aloud, is always really crazy to hear.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think based on all those kind of data points you just provided, if anyone is in the best place to talk data, it's definitely you. But we'll start with our quickfire questions that are designed to get to know you a little bit better. Starting with, what is your earliest memory of advertising?
Being a kid in the 90s, I think about these game show commercials on Nickelodeon where celebrities and kids would get drenched with slime, and it was this really nasty slime. And sometimes it was because the guests lost some sort of challenge. Sometimes it was just random. They slimed strangers, which I don't think you could do anymore. And it definitely was the MO of the network at the time. And the slime's this yellow-green color, the viscosity of it, the plasticky smell. These ads really activate the senses and really stick with me. They're imprinted on my brain. I grew up very close to there, and I always begged my parents to go. They never brought me, which maybe was a good thing in the long run.
I love that. I can completely remember those. And definitely those are kind of memories that stick with you. If you take yourself back to those days watching Nickelodeon, what did you want to be when you were younger, when you were growing up?
Okay, so nothing to do with our space now, nothing to do with data now. I really wanted to be a toll booth operator because my parents every day would drive through a toll, and I saw they gave money to this person, and I assumed it was his road, and they gave money. It's like, wow, this feels like a good, positive ROI type job I could have. So did not become a toll booth operator, but I did tell my kindergarten class that is what I aim to be.
I love that. So yeah, you didn't become that, but you obviously did arrive in the crazy and amazing world of media and advertising. So what was your first job in either advertising or marketing?
I had a very hands-on keys role at Dow Jones, where I worked on our B2B marketing team. Besides the Wall Street Journal and other consumer publications, the company has an entire data product suite. I guess this is where I got my data start as well, built on delivering news content in real time to other platforms. This data powered financial platforms at big banks. And so I worked directly with the folks that we were pumping data into, making sure the feeds didn't break. They broke all the time, and that my clients were kept abreast of the latest and greatest new data, new news content we were ingesting. It was fun. It was really hard. It was one of those jobs that I think we probably all have that you look back on. And it's both a mix of, oh man, I kind of blacked that out, but also like really I'm very grateful and very thankful for that job as well.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, and we do all have those roles in our history. What do you think it was that drew you in to the advertising industry then? And then what do you think keeps you in it to this very day?
Yeah. I think as the data guy in many rooms I find myself in, I think it's been just going down to data has a direct and measurable impact, right? It's easy to see. Data has a measurable impact on billions of dollars it's spending. It's not theoretical. So many folks work in spaces where it's harder to prove that value, but it's not theoretical. You can see how better data improves targeting, measurement, efficiency, you name it. There's a lot to fix, of course, like extremely so, but solving data challenges across different players, brands, ad tech platforms, agency, what everybody needs is a little bit different, but they all require creativity and strategic thinking, and that really kind of keeps me into the space.
Yeah, I love that. And I guess, we kind of touched on it right at the start. You are maybe one of the most famous people in our industry. You seem to be at every single event, which means you must meet a lot of people, both at PepsiCo, but also outside of PepsiCo, in the industry and wider, at different stages of their career. So, what advice would you give to someone that is maybe just starting in their career in media and advertising?
I love this. Don't be afraid to ask, how does this really work? A lot of what we do is predicated on assumptions. So please challenge them. Be respectful, of course, but it's so easy to nod along, especially when you're just starting out, right? But the people who grow the fastest are the ones who challenge how all of this works. To that, learn how the signals stitch together. Understand the programmatic plumbing, understand the value chain, who touches the ad, who profits from it. And as the data guy, where does the data come from? That's not asked nearly enough. And where does it flow? Media and advertising are increasingly connected with tech and culture. So the more context you can absorb, the better you'll become.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I didn't come from the advertising industry before I joined InfoSum. I came from the fintech industry. So it's a steep learning curve. And I think being that person in the room to just ask as many questions. And also, I think it's the courage to ask what might seem like the stupid question that probably everyone else in
Totally.
that room is thinking and asking, but
Yep.
no one wants to ask it. So just be that person to ask the question.
100%. Yep.
A two-part question. What keeps you awake at night? So what's kind of the stress factor? And then what gets you up in the morning? What's the kind of motivational factor?
What's stressful, Ben? A lot. I'm going to cast a wide net here, but I mean,
Yeah.
there's just so much inefficiency in the system, right? From an opaque supply chain, fragmented, inconsistent measurement solution. I'm just picking up things that are very topical for me at the moment.
Yeah.
There are these huge foundational issues that no single player can really fix, no matter how much money you throw at it. It's basically a prisoner's dilemma. We all know what needs to happen, but without collective action, we can't really do anything. So it's frustrating as an industry when we can kind of see through the glass wall, but we lack the tools to really break it. And the flip side of that, what keeps me proverbially up in the morning is that we have the smartest people in the world working on these problems at every single level. We have folks creating new and novel data signals, certainly in my world. We have folks working on driving accountability on ad fraud. We have finally moving the needle on genuine measurement solutions. Slowly, the energy and collaboration across the industry is what makes the space so exciting. It's a long road ahead, but I think exactly at this juncture right now, the momentum is real, and I think we're feeling it.
Yeah, I agree. It's the people that will drive the industry forward, and that's the kind of the most important part. You've kind of touched on just how complex, confusing our industry can be. So, how would you describe what you do within media and advertising to a 10-year-old?
I was recently talking about this with my little cousin when I went home to Florida. I saw she was wearing, this is probably not going to be the first Taylor Swift reference I'm going to make, but I saw
Okay,
she was
I
wearing
love
a
it.
Travis Kelce jersey. So I asked her,
Okay.
oh, wow, Sarah, are you wearing that because you like Taylor Swift or do you really like the Kansas City Chiefs? And she said, who? So with that insightful answer, it sort of led to us talking about how, my job is to help companies use data to figure
Yeah.
out where to put ads. So the right people are seeing them at the right moment, because just because people took the same action, in this case, purchased a football jersey, they are totally different groups of people, with different motivations, different outlooks, behaviors, demographics, of course. I'm not sure she got it, but it was a start.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. I think that works. And you've mentioned Taylor Swift, so that leads us very nicely into the final of our rapid fire questions, which is a personal favorite of mine, because it always gives me a little bit of a unique insight into everyone I get to speak to. If there was a song that was a soundtrack to your life, what would it be?
Ooh. I love traveling. I love being at the airport. I recently visited my
Mm,
94th country a few weeks ago.
wow.
Um, I know not many people can probably relate to loving the airport experience, but I certainly do. So I think it would have to be something flying related. I think of like leaving on a jet plane, John Denver, come fly
Mm.
with me, Frank Sinatra. A little bit cliche, but I think the kind of spark that travel and kind of flying mentality, and it probably fits the best for me.
Yeah, I can see that. I don't mind the airport experience once I get through security, once I get
Fair
through all that
enough.
and I can
Yeah.
relax.
Yeah. Have a
Like,
glass of
then I feel
wine. You're
good.
fine. Yeah.
The rest of it I can deal without.
Yeah.
Let's move into some of the more topic related questions. And let's start with a look at the industry as a whole today. You're obviously a data driven guy. So, how would you describe the current state of data in our industries? In our industry, are companies effectively using that data, or is there still a lot of work to be done from an activation and strategy perspective?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think we as an industry, I think we should acknowledge that we've come a long way in how we understand consumers. It's a good thing. Brands like ours can create products and experiences that are actually relevant to smaller and smaller groups of people, smaller segments of people. That's a good thing. There's
Yeah.
still a huge gap in actually putting that data to work. A lot of companies, a lot of folks I talk to at various events, have built massive data assets, but making that data actionable, totally another story. So
Yeah.
right now, my focus isn't just on collecting data. It's about making sure it's actually ready to drive real-time decision making, no matter what that question is at hand. So, and I think that's where a lot of folks still struggle. I hear from people all the time, there's no lack of people on LinkedIn talking about this, about their big investments in data infrastructure. But can you turn that investment into something that's seamless or moving towards seamless, that's actually useful across different teams and silos and different geographies? Good luck, because that's still a work in progress for a lot of different people. I think the companies that are ahead of the game here are the ones that have figured out how to do this, how to integrate their data across team. So it's not just sitting there actively shaping, across the campaign life cycle, targeting, personalization, media measurement, you name it here. So I think there's also in parallel a mindset shift that needs to happen. It's not more data, it's the right data and knowing how to use it. A data lake can easily turn into a data swamp because
Yeah.
everything is being held to it. It just kind of coalesces and it starts to rot. That comes with real costs, though: higher storage and compute expenses, legal risk, operational headaches. So the real opportunity is in curating the data that actually moves the needle for the problem at hand.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. It's something I think about a lot is the kind of the volumes of data that now exist in our industry. It feels like for the last few years, companies have become obsessed with collecting as much data as
Very
possible rather
much.
than necessarily, to your point, the right data. Right now, do you think as an industry we have too much data, just about enough, not the right amount? And where do you see the most significant gaps in our data that brands can leverage today?
I'll tell you, we definitely don't have a data shortage problem. That's for
Okay.
sure. I think
Yeah.
we have a kind of pick upping on the last question, we have a a data utility problem here. I think there's
Yeah.
more than enough information out there to drive smart decisions. Sure, we're always seeking more and more granular and more precise, of course, but we have enough to drive smart decisions. But too often, it's not in the right shape or place or format, right? I think you guys probably see this all the time
Yeah.
to be useful. I think there's two overarching issues. First, kind of piggybacking off the last question, there's there's an overload of data without a clear activation plan. Again, a lot
Right.
of folks are collecting huge amounts of data, but they don't have the right infrastructure, processes. They're really just people talent to turn it into something useful. It's like, I don't know, I'm not going to go to a grocery store and buy a bunch of fancy ingredients, but I'm not really a good cook. I'm probably not going to cook a great meal. And, so it's kind of like a very simplistic example, but it's that. In the second issue, no surprise to listeners here, is just generally fragmentation. Marketers work with so many different partners: ad tech, retailers, media platforms, you name it, each with their own way of measuring things, and they're usually their own walled off data. So without a way to connect all these different pieces, brands end up with a really messy, incoherent, inconsistent view of their audience. So, you know, in terms of gaps, one of the biggest gaps right now that's very topical for me is in standardization, especially in audience measurement and incrementality testing. There's no universal way to measure
Mm.
audiences across platforms. Again, this is not a shocking revelation here, but it makes it tough to compare performance, apples to apples. And, as a brand, it makes it really hard to prove impact of media investments
Yeah.
because every company seems to have its own little different approach. So, even going to these events, it's So it's a little bit hard. What did you mean by this? Okay, well, I meant this, and until we can align on these core measurement principles, brands are always going to keep running into the same wall here, proving ROI and making sure they're spending their budgets in the smartest way possible. It's really hard. It's really hard.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's interesting to think about PepsiCo. I find it super interesting to think about PepsiCo for a company that has the brand value of a PepsiCo, for a company that is so well recognized and known. What approach does PepsiCo take to collecting and accessing customer data? And how do you strike the right balance to ensure you're collecting the data you need rather than anything and everything, which we've just touched on?
It's a good question, Ben. I think PepsiCo is not so much striking a balance as in PepsiCo has a privacy first approach, full stop. PepsiCo has a privacy first approach to data collection that takes into account business needs, but also very much prioritizes consumer expectations. So instead of just collecting as much data as possible, we focus on value driven data collection, right? That means, we only gather data that has a clear purpose and it has to offer a tangible benefit to our end consumer. So I think our strategy here comes down to a few core principles. Firstly, we as a brand, we as a CPG prioritize first party data. We make investments in direct relationships with consumers, loyalty programs, owned e-commerce, D2C. This gives us cleaner, but it gives us permission data rather than just relying solely on third parties. Secondly, a big topic I'm hearing being spoken about a lot of events is on data minimization. That's very much top of mind for us. If data doesn't serve a clear business function, we don't collect it. More is not better. Better data is better. And thirdly, again, there has to be a value exchange. There has to be a clear consumer value exchange. We make sure when consumers share their data, they get something in return. Personalized offer, exclusive content, something improved along their path of purchase. We ensure this is distilled through the many partners. We work with tons of different vendors, hundreds of partners. We make sure this is distilled throughout those constellation of vendors as well. So at the end of the day, it's a fundamental part. This is a fundamental part of how we build trust with our consumers.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and it's as a Pepsi drinker and as a Pepsi consumer, that's good
the
to
right
hear.
answer.
In an organization the size of PepsiCo, where so many different departments, divisions, functions can benefit from accessing that data, using that data. We talk a lot about marketing, but obviously there's so many different use cases outside of marketing. Who owns the data strategy in an organization like PepsiCo? Is it IT? Is it operations? Is it marketing? Or is it kind of a mix of teams? And does that ownership differ region to region, depending on, obviously you have different regulatory environments and so on and so forth?
Data strategy at PepsiCo is centrally managed at a global level. This is a journey that the company's been on for the past 5 years to bring these different disparate resources that were sitting in different sectors, different geos, different brands, and bring them all in-house, ensures consistency and scalability across our 200 plus markets. While execution does happen at different functions in different regions as a more local level, the overarching strategy does roll up into a global unified framework. And, as part of this, key teams have been centralized into this organization, and they do play very interconnected roles here. We have centralized data governance and stewardship. They ensure, integrity, compliance, responsible usage across all the teams. The partnerships team is centralized. That's my team. We ensure, relationship with key external data providers, ensuring PepsiCo has the best of the best data for all the use cases it embarks on. We have central IT and engineering who own infrastructure, security, and tech development. We have to make sure the data is protected and accessible at all times. Also, we have centralized commercial teams. These folks are leveraging data for retail media, for sales optimization, our distribution partners. So I think all in all, Ben, having these layout here, this centralized processes and talent really allows us to build this strong foundation while allowing the very necessary flexibility for regional teams to tailor execution. Different markets are different when it comes to regulatory requirements, consumer behaviors, and technological capability. So it is centralized, but we do allow room for that local execution here.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think something I think about often from a brand perspective, when you have we touched on this a little bit earlier on, when you have a brand like PepsiCo that everywhere in the world has heard of PepsiCo, they drink Pepsi, they drink 7-Up, whatever their choice may be. And there's so much brand equity locked up in that. And therefore, I'm assuming consumer trust has to be the most paramount part of any kind of strategy within PepsiCo. How do you balance leveraging consumer data, because we know it works for business growth, whilst maintaining that trust and transparency with that end consumer?
It's a great question because you're right. But many of our brands are just truly iconic. They're
Yeah.
symbolic of they're symbolic of entire categories, even of entire countries. I bet if you asked 100 people to, you know, tell us your favorite, ad from the last 20 years, I bet a lot of them would say a Pepsi. We would say a PepsiCo ad, a
Yeah.
Super Bowl ad, something during a
Yeah.
large sporting event, because they are just genuinely so iconic. So we see trust as something that has to be built, and it's built through value exchange. It's built through transparency. We don't collect data because it's available. Again, we make sure there's that clear consumer benefit. So we to this, we have to be very upfront about our data usage. Of course, we are using data, we are collecting data, but we need to be upfront. Consumers should always know what data is being collected and how it benefits them. Again, we work with a ton of different vendors in sort of a constellation type network. We make sure all of these vendors have the same approach to this as well. We always prioritize security and compliance. There's rigorous data protection measures to keep up. To keep consumer regulation safe, or to keep consumer data safe, with differing regulations around the world. Obviously, LGBT in Brazil, CCPA, you name it, GDPR. And at the end of the day, it's really necessary to give consumers control here. We have to offer clear controls around data sharing and ensure our partners do the same. So ultimately, trust isn't built through legal disclaimers, not built through those quick little TNC boxes that you click through as fast as possible, right, to get through what you're trying to get through. It's built through consistent action. It's built through
Yes.
responsible action, brick by brick, over time. Because as you mentioned, our brand equity is absolutely enormous. So we treat this in a very respectable fashion as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned trust in that answer. And obviously, one of the trust factors that's coming up more and more at the moment is around ad fraud and kind of the challenges there. And we're seeing that come up in headlines unfortunately, on a very regular basis.
Yep.
So, how are brands like PepsiCo addressing the increasingly sophisticated threat of fraud, especially given the size of budgets that must exist in a company like PepsiCo?
Yeah, I could talk about this all day. I think
Yeah.
we should take a step back on this second, Ben, just to get a size of the problem. Within CTV and video, ad fraud is estimated to cost billions of dollars to advertise every single year. I saw recently 30 billion in the US, 100 billion globally, and I think that's just the part of the iceberg above the water. We don't
Yeah.
even know how deep the iceberg is below the water. And I think, very quickly, several factors go into this. Why is this problem, one, still with us, and why is it ballooning and evolving? I think firstly, kind of speaking a little bit more narrowly about CTV, but this generally applies across the board here. There are technical problems here. Within CTV, gaps in CTV infrastructure facilitate fraud. We have technologies like SSAI, server-side ad insertion, allows folks to insert ads into video streams with the server side. Super cool, has a lot of pros. But fraudsters, bad actors, can use this technology to generate non-human impressions and fake ad requests at scale. We have to acknowledge the operational complexities of our ecosystem, right? We work in a hard space. I'm sure you guys know this very well. It's very complex. It's very opaque. There's tons of intermediaries that make it difficult to verify inventory quality. The fact that we don't even have standards on transparency reporting further add to this. It really makes it hard it really makes it easier for fraudulent impressions to track through. And I think finally, we also have to acknowledge that, there's some commercial aspects here, some commercial incentives here. The programmatic model demands scale. And
Yeah.
many intermediaries prioritize volume over quality. Makes total sense. It's their business model. So a lot of these bad actors can profit by generating fake traffic that looks legitimate to various intermediaries, just kind of hidden within the folds of how we pay each other as an industry. To that, I would say working with trusted third-party verification vendors is absolutely critical. They provide this independent, externally verifiable lens, and they do create transparency into these black box processes that brands otherwise don't have a window to. This is definitely a strategy PepsiCo is certainly leaning into. But if I can get on my soapbox just one more time, but for more lasting change, more durable change, the industry has to come together and demand more accountability for media quality. This is the prisoner's dilemma type thing all over again. Brands, agencies, tech intermediaries, in my opinion, the major industry groups all have a role to play on here. I could spend the whole next podcast talking about this. So, but building shared responsibility via enforceable mechanisms is the only way to put the entire industry on a better path for fraud reduction, in my view.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's super critical. I think it's one of the most critical challenges we face as an industry. I think one of the other challenges we've faced, and another topic that's grabbing more and more headlines, which is near and dear to my heart and near and dear to the hearts of everyone at InfoSum, is privacy and the kind of evolving regulatory landscape. How does PepsiCo approach compliance with privacy regulation across so many different regions while maintaining that kind of cohesive data strategy that you touched on earlier?
200 plus markets. It's crazy, right?
Yeah.
It's almost overwhelming if you think about it. So rather than treating compliance as a country by country checklist, that's almost impossible.
Yeah.
PepsiCo takes a very principles-based approach to privacy. So that means, that means that we align global data practices with evolving regulations rather than scrambling to adjust when new laws take effect. So there's a few pillars that undergird this. Firstly, PepsiCo has a very privacy by design approach to compliance. Transparency, security, and again, that consumer control is embedded into data policies from right from the beginning, rather than attempting to bolt it on later. That's hard and messy and it's going to lead to error and maybe some other worse things down the road. So we don't do it like that. Again, PepsiCo has a global governance model, but allows for regional flexibility. So while we do have centralized privacy policies to ensure consistency, we do have to work closely with local teams to tailor execution, right? Because again, GDPR, CCPA, LGBT in Brazil, all a little bit different, and they're changing all the time. So we have to work with local teams to tailor that execution in a more local manner. And thirdly, just PepsiCo is a massive company. We have immense talent in our ranks, and we have a giant network of external connections. So we are always collaborating with legal teams, policy experts, and regulatory bodies to stay ahead of these shifts. Proactive engagement will always help a business maintain business continuity in the long run versus, reactive measures here, trying to bolt things on the end. So I think ultimately brands that will thrive in this evolving is probably a nice way to say it. Evolving privacy landscape are the ones that go just beyond compliance. We have to build those trusted, value-driven relationships with consumers rather than just doing the minimum, rather than just checking the box and following the rules here.
Yeah, I agree. And you touched on kind of what brands should be doing to prepare for this. I suspect, the privacy regulation is only going to evolve further. I think the latest number I saw was like 78% of the world's population is now covered by modern privacy regulation, wow. And that number is only going to increase. Wow. So what do you think is the next big challenge or opportunity from a privacy perspective? And how can brands prepare for that today?
Yeah, I think in my mind, it's the real challenge isn't a single event. It's this ongoing crescendo in evolution in consumer expectations, especially specifically around transparency. Consumers increasingly want more and more say over how their data is used across more platforms, more screens, and more aspects of their digital and physical experiences. We internally are calling it phygital, the combination of digital and physical right here. So brands that fail to keep up with these rising demands risk eroding that trust and losing these direct relationships. So again, I talking about this trend a lot, talking about this topic a lot, but to do this, it's all about expanding consumer control. Consumers expect easy to use privacy controls, not just on websites, not just on apps. That's so last few years, right? It's across streaming platforms, across smart devices, across their TV, across their smart refrigerator, and even in-store experiences, right? Consumer expectations are moving faster than regulations can be set. Two, is the evolution of data collection. The focus is shifting from broad scale tracking to explicit value exchanges, which is very good, where consumers willingly share data in return for clear benefits here. We're also seeing, again, no shocker to you guys, we're seeing the rise of new privacy technologies, clean rooms, federated learnings, consent-driven personalization, which are helping brands adapt, but they do require a mindset, a strategy, and investment shifts here. And also, at the end of the day, there'll always be a little level of interoperability challenges here. Different platforms, different ecosystems adopt different privacy standards. Brands have to navigate fragmented privacy environments while still trying to deliver seamless experiences for their end consumers. And that's really, really hard. So rather than reacting to each platform change, new policy, again, 200 markets, it's pretty hard. Brands, and I think PepsiCo is doing a great job of this, need a long-term privacy strategy that prioritizes that trust, that flexibility, that transparency. I think those that embrace privacy as a brand differentiator, not just to check the box of the compliance, are the ones that will thrive because they're the ones that have to thrive.
Yeah, I completely agree. I couldn't agree more. I think it's so important kind of how you opened that answer, which was around the kind of the consumer expectations. I think consumers are more aware than ever how their data is being used, right? We've seen Netflix documentaries on it. So their awareness is so much higher, but also I think consumers are starting to better understand the value exchange that takes place. I think people just took the access to the open web as a given, and that was just kind of what they got, and they didn't really understand that actually their data is what's then powering that through, or their eyeballs is what's then powering that. Now they're seeing it, right? Oh, okay, I get a cheaper Netflix subscription if I agree to have ads. So they're starting to understand that there is a direct correlation between value and their eyeballs and advertising.
Absolutely.
So I think it's definitely driving a consumer awareness. And I also think from a consumer perspective, obviously one of the things that consumers interact with most from an advertising perspective is the creative. From, it's the ads they see on TV, it's the ads they see on social or as they scroll the web. As someone who works deeply in the data, how do you balance the science of the analytics with the creative, more intuitive side of marketing?
The best marketing has always been a mix of art and science here. And I think just the way we bring those two together is evolving. It's not just about optimizing performance. Data is not just about optimizing performance. It should fuel creativity to some degree. When used right, data can empower creativity to understand people better, uncover insights we may not have seen otherwise, and ultimately just tell better stories. At the end of the day, that's really what it's all about. And I'm going to pull out my earlier example of my little cousin wearing a Travis Kelce jersey. I think this is my second Taylor Swift reference of the pod. Like a simplistic example, but if someone buys a Travis Kelce jersey, the raw data might just tell us, okay, they're a football fan, they're a Chiefs fan. But I think that's where, the creative side can actually come in, because what if they actually bought it because they're a brand new Swiftie? Like myself, caught up in the broader cultural moment. If you only look at the transaction, you only look at that individual data piece, you might assume they want football related content. But if you dig deeper, maybe they're engaging with Taylor Swift content online. Maybe they're listening to the new album on the way to work. Maybe they're following broader pop culture trends on TikTok. That opens up a completely different way to understand and connect with those folks. So I think that's the balance right here, right? Analytics can tell us what happened, and we can even stitch that signal with other things about their behaviors and outlooks and feelings, which is great. But then marketing's creativity side comes in, and that's what helps you translate why it matters and how to act on it. So, then of course we have the feedback loop here, right? We're not just launching a campaign and just hope it worked. Real-time data lets us see what's resonating, what needs tweaking. It's like having a conversation with the audience rather than just talking. Not even to them, but at them, The most effective marketing doesn't feel like it comes from an algorithm. Again, name your favorite ad from the last 10 years. I will guarantee you it felt real and authentic. Data helps us get there, but creativity, that balance here, that creativity side is what really makes it stick.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that ability to stitch together different viewpoints, different perspectives is so important. There's an example I often give, which is a few years ago now, but there was a platform that you could go in and you could look at what a company thought they knew about you and therefore how they were serving ads. And they categorized me as a massive American football fan. Now, at the risk of losing a lot of my American audience, I've never watched an American football game in my life. It's not something that particularly interests me. I don't even watch, British football. But I spend a lot of time at the gym watching like Super Bowl performances, the halftime shows, while whilst doing cardio. And my assumption has always been they've made some kind of connection there between Super Bowl in the video. And so it's that ability to, again, to your point, to stitch together those different pieces of information to create a better picture that actually, you know, advertising when, you know, the NFL comes to London probably isn't going to work very well on me.
Nope.
But maybe the latest Lady Gaga concert might work a little bit better. So it's
great. Amazing. Yep.
One of the other challenges that our industry faces on a consistent basis, and you already touched on this, is measurement, which is kind of the gift that keeps on giving as far as kind of topics on this podcast, especially for CPG brands, right? That don't always have that direct consumer relationship. So how does PepsiCo approach that challenge? And what innovations in measurement that are coming excite you most?
Yeah, this is the $1 million question, right? This is the
there we go.
$1 billion question, right? Measurement has always been really hard, but as you said, Ben, the landscape is super quickly, rapidly evolving. You know, we've seen retail media networks, AI-driven attribution, fragmented identity is getting harder and harder, right? That's the tale of, we've talked about this for a long time, but it's transforming how we connect media spend to business outcomes. So PepsiCo is focused on understanding the full impact of our investments. We're not trying to prove causality at the impression level. We're trying to prove impact at the behavior level. I think that's a little bit of a difference in mindset and strategy than we've had in the past. So one of the biggest shifts we're trying to tackle, super easy, is in measuring CTV. You know, this channel lacks the same level of transparency as other spaces. Again, we have a fragmented signal chain, poor or outdated or poorly deduplicated exposure data. We rely a lot on proxies, but with better first-party data strategies, we can rely on clean rooms and other tools to help with the interoperability of signals. We are making some progress in bridging that gap here. So what excites me the most is this push toward, you know, it's probably zooming out a little bit, but more holistic real-time measurement. You know, I think the brands that win will be the ones that treat measurement not as a one-time report to send upstairs, but as a continuous process. It's no longer enough to look at the results, you know, weeks or months after the fact. We need to optimize in real time, shifting budget, shifting creative, shifting talent, shifting processes in real time based on what's working and what's not. Again, this is really hard and definitely will require collective action. I feel like this is a trend we're picking up on. This definitely will require collective action across many folks in the industry to actually, you know, move the needle in a large step kind of way. But we are inching toward this. You know, the future of measurement definitely isn't about just having more data. It's about having that right data and making sense of it faster to drive smarter decision. I think that's where the real innovation is happening. And that's definitely a tactic that PepsiCo is really leaning into.
Yeah, I think it's one of the areas of our industry that is going to evolve. Well, it's been evolving rapidly for a long time, but it feels like it's evolving even more rapidly now. It feels like we are on the right track. I feel like we could bring you back in a year's time, and it would be hopefully a different conversation, and we may have evolved even further. And obviously, this podcast is all about individuals like yourself who are pioneering those new ways to use the right data to deliver the better and right customer experiences. So, when you look to people that you admire within the industry, who would you nominate for me to interview on an upcoming episode of Identity Architects?
This is easy. I would say Elizabeth Donovan. Elizabeth Donovan is someone I very much look up to. She's now running commerce and retail media at Kinesso. But before that, she built the Marriott Retail Media Network before that was even a thing. She's at the vanguard of tech. She's at the vanguard of data. And honestly, she's just a great and really inspirational human. So very highly recommend you talking to Elizabeth Donovan.
I love that. We will definitely reach out and try and get her on the podcast. Zach, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. I feel like I could have just kept picking your brains for hours to come, so we may have to do a part two.
Amazing.
But luckily, I will probably see you speak at an event soon and get to pick your brains there as well. Thank you so much for being on the podcast for me today, and thank you so much for sharing so much valuable information with everyone.
Thanks so much, Ben. I appreciate it.
Thanks again to Zach for being on the podcast. It was great to dig deeper into not only the current data landscape, but how companies like PepsiCo are prioritizing data privacy and the appropriate use of data. All that's left for me to do is to remind you to hit that subscribe button to know when the next episode of Identity Architects lands. But until then, thanks for listening.